Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Antonin Artaud and Journey to Mexico by Stuart Kendall. About the course, on January 10, 1936, the poet, actor, and dramatic theorist Antonin Artaud departed Europe on a journey to Mexico that would take him not only to the streets, cafés, and lecture halls of Mexico City, but to remote mountains of the Sierra Tarahumara. On the journey would only last 10 months, culminating in some 6 to 8 weeks spent among the Rarámuri of Tarahumara. Still, the motivations, challenges, and limits that characterized the trip have only become more relevant to our lives on this warming planet. Tracing the complex itineraries of Artaud's journey to Mexico, this seminar will take us far to the limits of art and anthropology, myth and religion. We will confront the legacies of colonial conquest and the possibility of alternatives in a search for a vital and ecologically viable forms of culture. Stuart Kendall is a writer, editor, and translator working at the intersections of philosophy, poetics, media, and design. He's best known as the author of a biography of Georges Bataille, published in Réaction Books series Critical Lives, and as the editor and translator of 7 volumes of Bataille's writings, including Inner Experience, Guilty, On Nietzsche, The Unfinished Systems of Non-Knowledge, and The Cradle of Humanity. He has given lectures at conferences, colloquia, and symposiums nationally and internationally, and taught in a number of fields at colleges and universities, including Stanford University, Boston University, SUNY, Stony Brook, and the California College of the Arts. And also a few books about the recent, a few words about the recent book by Stuart. First, we would like to congratulate you, and because it's how long it's out, like this year, right? So a few months ago.
Yes.
So it's like pretty fresh, and the book is called Journey to Mexico: Revolutionary Messages and the Tarahumara. As far as I understand, like this seminar is very much like focused on the content of this book, and we have readings actually from it. So we really recommend everyone to buy it actually, and we sent the link where you could buy it at Amazon or something. Yeah, so I think that it's all for my part. Stuart, I give you the mic. You can start the session.
Okay, great. This is the first seminar I've done with the new center, so I'm new to this particular group and audience, and that I don't think that should matter too much. As you heard, I've taught many different kinds of things in different ways over many years. So this is just another one of them. However, I'm very much interested in seeing where a group like this, which is an international group with different interests and different goals, might take this material. So it's exciting to me to be in this space, virtual as it is. And I should say also, I'm quite open to taking this material into as many directions as we want to take it. There are certain things that obviously I want to say about this material that I've been thinking about for a long time. But hopefully you're here for specific reasons. I mean, all of you, and you have interest in this topic, these themes, whether it's Artaud or it's particular aspects of his journey to Mexico, whatever it is. Let's hope that we all bring something to this virtual table so that we can pull this bit apart. I mean, to me, the whole point here is for us to spend time together looking at this material and asking questions about it. Artaud, and this is going to be apparent as we move along. Artaud is obviously a very famous figure. He's known in many fields, and I'll say more about this later, but that doesn't mean that he's right about everything. He's catastrophically wrong about many things. His life was a failure in many ways, and I'm just quoting Susan Sontag on that view. So one of the things that we want to do is assess what he thought he was doing, whether that thing was a good idea, whether we can do anything with that. Can we improve upon his project? Is it the right kind of a project? All that kind of stuff. In other words, we're not taking Artaud's word as gospel. However you want to, or whatever your metaphor might be. Artaud is not right. He's a figure that we are going to push back against, that we're going to tease apart. So he is an opportunity for us to ask a series of questions, and those questions are far more important than the individual example that Artaud provides. So obviously we're going to do this over the next 4 weeks on Saturdays, and we have 2.5 hours each time, just outlining the way this will work. I've assigned some readings that you see from the syllabus, and the expectation is that you prepare those readings prior to class so that we can get the most out of it. Again, I'm going to have some points that I want to highlight in each of those readings, but hopefully you will too. So there'll be themes that emerge very obviously, but other things, there will be other things to discuss. So hopefully we'll be open to that. The format of the new center requires us to have presentations. So today we will not have one, but at the end of class, I hope we can kind of go around and just say a few words about interests and who each of you are. But the next 3 weeks, we'll have presentations. These are done by groups. And I think Ivan's going to do some things to help set that up at that, toward the end of class, and then after class. There are themes for these presentations, and that's how I'd like to do it. So the first one will be the notion of revolution. This is the thing to talk about next week. We're going to talk about revolution today, or the idea of revolution. What is revolution? How does it happen? Other things. This will happen in our discussions today, but it'll also be a major topic for next week's discussion. So revolution is sort of a 2-week bleed over theme. The second presentation in the 3rd week of class is on the notion of decolonization, which is a big theme recently in, I'm not sure what I want to say, many fields. We can also think of this as a question about what I would call the indigenous turn. So what is it to look towards the indigenous peoples of the world, whatever that might be, and also how might one become indigenous? So what is it to become local? And I'll say more about this later. But that's the third theme of a presentation. And then in the final class, that 4th week, we're going to be looking at Artaud's journey to the actual land of the Tarahumara and the peyote rite that he discusses there. So that's going to be the theme of altered states of consciousness. So 3 presentations, or 3 opportunities for presentation: revolution, the indigenous turn or decolonization, and altered states of consciousness. So I'm saying that now just to sort of put it in the back of your mind, because later on Ivan's going to ask you some questions about signing up for those things. What else do I want to say about that? I think that's pretty much the sort of mechanics of the class. In a Zoom format, things are obviously a little bit delayed because we're all around the world. But again, this should be a seminar where there's not just me talking. I'm probably going to do a lot of talking today, but this should be a space where we all get to say some things. So however we can facilitate that, I'd like to see that happen, whether that's raising a hand with the hand icon in Zoom, or whatever you'd like to do. Ivan is here to facilitate to a certain extent that type of thing, but don't let things go unsaid. And this is to say, interrupt, interrupt me. I could talk for hours and frequently do. So go ahead and stop me and say, hey, whoa, wait a second, let's circle back. Let's ask a question about that. Or, if I touch briefly on something, or, whatever it is that would be helpful to you to be engaged in the material and to get what you're looking for out of this conversation. So, I have a plan. I know where I'm going. I can be interrupted and I will still get where I'm going. If we run out of time today, things will get shortened, things will get extended, things will bleed into next week. It's not a big deal. So if you got something to say or a question to ask or just a point to make, then absolutely, let's have that happen. Those are the basic mechanics of the class. So so now I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I have a number of topics that I want to talk about today, and I asked you to do some readings in preparation for today. So hopefully you've had a chance to do those. I guess in terms of the readings, I should say, I put PDFs of two well-known English language anthologies of writings by Artaud in the folder for the class. One of those is the famous Selected Writings volume. So we're not reading the entirety of this. We're reading selections that are marked by page numbers on the syllabus. I also put a PDF of Mary Carolyn Richards' translation of The Theater in Its Double. Here again, we're reading, one section of this, and possibly another one is available there. But the primary text in this class is the book that was mentioned earlier, and this is the book Antonin Artaud, Journey to Mexico, that I edited for Contramundum Press. It's translated by Rainer J. Hanscha. It came out in February of this year or so, maybe March. In fact, March 4th, for Artaud's, the anniversary of his death. This is a book that collects the majority of Artaud's writings about his journey to Mexico, and that's the point of it. There's no other book in any language that collects all of this material. So if you're reading it in Spanish, you can read the collection Revolutionary Messages, which is mostly newspaper articles and lectures, and you can read the Tarahumara writings. So again, newspaper articles and that kind of thing, some poems and a few letters. But this volume includes earlier materials, a scenario that he wrote for his abortive theater of cruelty called The Conquest of Mexico. It includes the full extent of letters relevant to this journey. It's the only place in, again, any language where you can, between two covers, find all of this material and trace the journey kind of as a whole. That's not to say that it has every single piece of writing that Artaud did about his journey to Mexico. There are stray bits and pieces that were published in Havana, for example, for articles that were published there that I did not include here. There's another piece that was found in an archive that is unpublished, sort of draft material found later. And then at the end of Artaud's life, after his return from Rodez, he talks about Mexico very frequently. He writes poems about it. He gives lectures that touch upon it as part of the broader theme of his life. And to have all of that, every single scrap of reference would make the book, which is already almost 500 pages, unbearably long. So it's the place where you can go to see the full arc of the experience. And that's why I'm interested in the project. But it doesn't include every single scrap. Nevertheless, it's the place to go to trace this journey. And that's the plan of this class. What we want to do is trace the journey. We want to ask why he went there, what he thought he was going to do. And then we want to see how that happened, what sent him there as a specific journey. And then what happened when he got there. Did he ever arrive is a question that I might ask as we follow his steps in this way. And then what happened afterwards? What was the sort of fallout of this, not only for him, but in his work and more broadly. So what themes can we take from that? There's a lot to say about that. Another thing to say in that regard is, though I have asked you to read specific sections of the book, it's quite long. So I've asked us to sort of focus on a few passages, chapters, articles, lectures that I think tell us the most. But presumably, if you're here, you're interested in this material. And that's to say that you might go ahead and just read this whole book. And if you do, that's great. So if your interest spills over the bounds of the assigned readings into sections that I did not assign, that's totally fine. Let's talk about it. Also, if there are other things, by Artaud or about his life or his legacy that are on your mind, bring those to class too. This is the kind of space where we can go in and out. I'm going to focus quite narrowly on some passages, but if we want to bring our discussion into a broader frame, let's do so. I suppose that's enough in terms of the mechanics of the class. Now, we're here to talk about Artaud's journey to Mexico, but really my interest is in three broad themes, sort of plus one, that animate that journey. And these are themes that we could find in any number of other bodies of work, say in the work of Georges Bataille or Nietzsche, or in a poet like Gary Snyder. And these are three areas of change that Artaud is trying to affect. So there's this revolution that he wants to bring about, this change in culture. And there are three aspects of it that are important and that are the main kind of drivers in the class. Now, Felix Guattari or Gregory Bateson might think of these things as three ecologies. And that's the lens that I'm going to be using to think about Artaud's experience in Mexico. And so I want to stress these themes right now so that we can follow them, or think about how they interrelate in the class. These are not the themes that will organize our days, but they were themes that we will see constantly and in relationship to one another in different ways at different times. And so these are the themes of culture or society. So this thing that we swim in all the time. Artaud wanted to change this culture. He asked, what is this culture and how can we change it? What's wrong with it and how can we fix it? But beyond that, he was also interested in, the problem of place and ecology. He went to a specific place. He went far from home, right? He went from Paris to Mexico City and then up into the Sierra Tarahumara. This is a certain way, it's like the hero's journey. He's leaving home, but he's leaving home in order to find a new relationship to place. And this is where the notion of indigeneity is going to come in, asking questions about what it is to live in a specific place. So this is an ecological question. And this is a question that Artaud frames in terms of the relationship between a human being and a culture caught between the earth and the sun. So it's a very, it's an interest in the natural world, in the ecological, encounter, in the environmental encounter. And that's not a theme that we often associate with Antonin Artaud, but it's one that I want to highlight because it is central to his interest in this period of his life. And we need to think about what that means and why it came to the fore in that moment. Just exactly what does he think he's doing? And is that, kind of something that we still think about doing, this notion of ecology cast in that way? So on the one hand, culture, on the other hand, environment or ecology. These are all three ecologies, but this relationship to nature. And then thirdly, consciousness, the individual. How do we as individuals or as individual consciousness relate to these things? How do we relate to society and, culture, what we are doing? How does our body and mind relate to these things? And then how do we relate to place? So these are all three things that Artaud is interested in sort of encountering, but also affecting change within. Three ecologies: the cultural, the environmental, and then that of the individual consciousness. Three things that he desperately wanted to change, each for different reasons. So that's sort of the main structure of my interest in this material. And that, like I said, this is something that we're going to see almost in every single reading that we do, and every aspect of our discussion will be some exploration of one or another of those things, sort of dialing up and dialing down. And I said three themes plus one, because that third one, or fourth one rather, is related to this, is the thing that links all of these. And it's a theme that Artaud is going to explore most passionately, that in fact drives his core interest. And it's a problem in his work that he fails to solve. And so what we're going to do in this course really is look at the ways that he grapples with the relationship between spirit or mind and matter and nature. So where is meaning located? How do we encounter meaning? Does the world have meaning that is out there away from us? Is the meaning something that we bring to the world with our imagination or understanding, with knowledge? Can we understand the meaning of the world? Where does that come from? Now, Artaud in the 1930s is going to grapple with this question, this spirit-matter dualism. He's going to grapple with it in his readings. It will motivate the books that he reads, but he's also going to grapple with it in his journey to Mexico. He goes to Mexico in search of an answer to where do we find meaning, to that question. How do we encounter it? I'm going to say something more about this a little bit later, but it's a strange, again, point of emphasis in Artaud. And another thing to say about it is that it's a question that he himself does not solve or answer effectively. He starts with one sort of orientation to this problem in the 1920s and early 1930s. His cultural investigations and activism throughout the 1930s propose different ways of thinking about this relationship. By the end of the 1930s, after the journey to Mexico, he has still another way of thinking about it. And then after his return from Rodez, he has still another way to think about this problem. So it's a thing that makes this issue makes reading Artaud very challenging because he doesn't have a unified, let's say, philosophy or theory on this point. He thinks one thing in the 1920s, another thing in the 1930s, and still another thing in the 1940s. So following his journey through this will require us to be careful and attentive, let's say, to that. But it's also quite a dramatic search, this search for meaning that he's engaged with. So there's a lot to sort of pull apart in that regard. Right. So those are the broad themes. As I said a few minutes ago, we're going to be looking at this across 4 days. Today, we're focusing on the notion of revolution, but also this question of the kind of what sent Artaud to Mexico. That's the big theme for today. Why did he go there? Sort of, who was he? So I want to do a little background sketch, biographical stuff. I want to orient us, as I'm doing already, to this reading, but I want to ask some very precise questions about who he is as a person and what were his goals precisely in the fall of 1935, sort of second half of 1935 as he began to conceive of this journey. Those are our goals for today. At the end of today, we're going to be launching into the beginning of his time in Mexico, but we don't quite get there. We glimpse it, but we're not necessarily all the way there. Next week, however, we're there. Next week, we're going to be asking questions about Mexico itself. And that is to say, we're asking questions about why did he leave Europe as it relates to Mexico? Why did he go to Mexico as opposed to someplace else? And that's a very important question in the 1930s. Other people were going to the Soviet Union. Artaud went to Mexico. So we need to think about his journey to Mexico in relationship to the journeys that other intellectuals made to places like the Soviet Union. What was unique about the Mexican Revolution that sent Artaud there? This is the big question for next week. And of course, also, how is that related to his critique of modern, secular, scientific, industrial, capitalist, bourgeois civilization in Europe? Artaud's journey to Mexico was very much a rejection of Europe as much as it was a search for something in Mexico. So we need to look at that next week, so that the following week we can ask, what did he find there? This is the question about the indigenous turn in his work. What was he looking for in indigenous communities? What did he hope to find? And did he find it? Can one find it? So these are, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a question about leaving home, going someplace. And there's a question there about whether or not one can actually leave home or arrive at someplace. Here I think of this under the theme of sort of art, Mexico and its doubles, as Artaud would say. Mexico is many things. And Artaud's Mexico, I'm inclined to think of it always in sort of quotation marks. Is it Mexico? Are we really talking about Mexico at all? There are many Mexicos. Which one is Artaud going to, and why? Then, of course, the fourth week, again, we're going to be following him into the land of the Tarahumara. And we need to remember that he went to the Tarahumara for many reasons that are obscure and sort of unclear to us. I think retrospectively, due to Artaud's legacy, we think of him as going there for certain reasons that have to do with taking peyote and altered states of consciousness. And that has something to do with the way that Artaud has been interpreted by various communities in different places around the world. And this is something to do with the publication of history of his books, and there's a great deal more to say about that. But Artaud's purpose there was quite complicated and nuanced, even though when he arrived, again, it was quite a failure and a train wreck of a situation for him personally. So what exactly happened there? Artaud's journey to the land of the Tarahumara was a journey in space, but it was also a journey in time. And we need to think about that. What I mean by that is that he was trying to find the sort of oldest roots of indigenous culture there. He wanted to escape modernity, not just in its sort of outward trappings, but in every possible way. So there's a lot to think about in terms of that journey and its impact on Artaud. We're going to try and focus on this question of consciousness, but there's a lot to say about the way that about his experiences there, and then how he grappled with them. So some of the readings for that week will be things that were written in the immediate aftermath of the journey, which is to say in October and November of 1936, before he even returned to Europe. But other things that we're going to read that week are things that he wrote almost 10 years later. So, and even later. He kept writing about his experiences among the Tarahumara. And we have to ask questions about that. How is it that his writings become most, let's say, precise, the farther away from the actual experience itself that they become? So which of these things should we believe? How should we believe it? Did he even go there? Is a question that scholars ask. So we're gonna parse a lot of that. At the heart of it, though, is Artaud searching for as I said, this relationship between a mind and a body in a place, in a culture. It's to say that there's an interest in ritual behavior as it's a form of gesture and a way of understanding our experience in the world. That's where we're going in this, across these weeks, these sort of layers that we want to travel through. I've been talking for a little while. Do we have any questions about the plan or anything like that? Anything? Because otherwise I'm going to launch into some biographical background, and then we can, I think I should probably just do that. And then we can talk about some of the readings for today. Okay, so I'll do this. So it's maybe already clear that I'm reading Artaud in a more, let's say, expansive way than I think he's often read. And Artaud's a challenging figure. There are many biographies of Artaud, and we're sort of attracted, I would say, readers are attracted to the dramas of his life. There are also obviously a great many sort of theoretical appropriations of Artaud, and we need to think about that. So sort of which Artaud are we reading? You know, who is this guy? In a sort of sketch moment, I will say that I think there are levels at which we can read Artaud. We can read him as a kind of avant-gardist, right? Actor, poet, or a man of letters. When you think about what that means, visual artist, right? At the end of his life, he was deeply influenced by Baudelaire and Rimbaud, Lautréamont, Edgar Allan Poe. You know, so he comes out of this strain of modernist poetry and thought, particularly in France. He was a member of the Surrealist group, and we'll say a great deal more about this a few minutes later. But we need to remember that for in the Surrealist group, Artaud was particularly close friends with André Masson and Michel Leiris. So while he had a contentious and complicated relationship with André Breton, the kind of camaraderie that he found was with André Masson. And there's a lot to say about that, and we'll come back to it later. In any case, what I'm arguing here is that Artaud is an artist and a poet and a avant-gardist. But that's not all that he is. Artaud is also, and we'll see this developing in some of the readings for today, he's also let's call him a mystic philosopher. He's a person who read very deeply in the history of comparative religions. So he is just as likely, and not just comparative religions, but also the history of alchemy, esoteric and hermetic thought, and the occult. So Artaud is interested in a very, very wide range of materials. And we see these things deepening across his writings. We're going to see it today, comparing the two major essays that he has on the Surrealist group. But that's something that we need to chart as we read the rest of the materials, and as we think about situating him. If we simply read Artaud as a member of the European avant-garde, or as another poet in the line of Rimbaud, then we've misunderstood Artaud profoundly. Artaud is that, but he's also someone deeply, deeply influenced by the history of the occult. And so just exactly what does that mean? How does that influence his choice to go to Mexico, or what he would call the Red Earth, based on an occult reading? And where does that take him? So how does it help him be wrong, and how does it help him be right? But that's also, it's a strange way, let's say, I think it's a bit of a strange way to read Artaud. A lot of the sort of theoretical appropriations of Artaud make no mention of these facts. They don't highlight that level of his work. And it's something that gets, I think, pushed to the side for various reasons. If we want Artaud to be a sort of secular artist, then he can't be part of the history of the occult. So we need to think about how that influences his work, and just exactly where it is. But that's not all that motivates Artaud. Another thing we want to talk about a great deal today is the fact that Artaud, Artaud's life was a life of pain. It was a life of psychological and physical pain. It was a life that led him into really lifelong addiction to opiates. He died of a drug overdose, accidental or otherwise. He struggled with addiction throughout his life. So we need to think about how his pain and his addiction shaped his life. And that's something I want to spend a great deal of time talking about today. But it's central to his journey to Mexico. If we're going to foreground this question of peyote, we need to understand his relationship to pain, to drug use, to the legalization of drugs, the regulation of drugs, however we're going to think about that. We need to put that in a much wider frame than we often do. We need to think about Artaud's consciousness, which I think is a fairly common theme in his work, but we don't necessarily, I would say, take it maybe as seriously as we should. So I want to highlight the body in pain. And that's going to be a big theme in a few minutes. But then finally, on this sort of sketch introduction to problems of reading Artaud, he's a guy that comes to us ready-made to a certain extent. We've heard about him already. He comes to us through theoretical appropriations of his work, through his impact on the history of theater and the arts. It's very difficult, I think, to approach Artaud cleanly and directly, which is what we're doing in this class, right? We're reading primary sources. We're not reading Derrida on Artaud in this class. That would be a fun class. We might do that later, but that's not what we're doing here. We can talk about that, absolutely. Deleuze and Guattari on Artaud. What did they borrow from Artaud? How did they read Artaud? These are very interesting questions. The Telkel group, Julia Kristeva, Philippe Solers, how did they read Artaud? These are very interesting questions, but they're sort of somewhat to the side of what we're doing here. What I want to do is kind of fight through all that to a certain extent. And I'll say also that I think Artaud has different histories in different countries. There are different Artauds floating around all around the world. And so trying to fight our way through that legacy to understand will the real Artaud stand up? That's one of the challenges of reading a figure like Artaud. And there's a great deal more to say about challenges presented by Artaud as a figure. The mere fact that, it's 100 years since Artaud's first most significant publications, his correspondence with Jacques Rivière from 1924, it's 100 years ago, and it's only now that there's a book in English collecting all of his material on the journey to Mexico, and that there is no book anywhere else doing that same thing that collects all of it. So Artaud is a figure who has been much celebrated. He's had a tremendous influence on many fields, but he also remains largely unknown and unread. And it's still very difficult to read Artaud, in the sense of accessing the material. That's changing right now. One reason it's changing is, of course, that his work has gone out of copyright protection. So now there can be far more translations of the work into any number of languages than previously. So there's a lot more to say about that. It's a great theme that interests me, but it's somewhat to the side of what we're talking about. In any case, what I'm saying, avant-gardist, mystic, addict, influence, problems in reading Artaud, themes, layers in the work. But how do we think about that biography? We can say a great deal about his biography. In leading us up to the questions from Mexico, I want to divide his life into 4 major parts, and just say a little bit about each one before we turn to these questions about the body and pain and the specific readings for today. So again, the whole point is to orient us to the journey to Mexico, thinking about what he was doing. This is all still broadly introductory. So 4 phases, or really 3 phases plus 1. I think we can talk about Artaud's work in the early period of his life, which is to say from the 1920s until around 1931, as his period of his period as an artist. So this is the period in which he is publishing works like the Umbilicus of Limbo and the Nerve Meter, and his correspondence with Jacques Rivière. This is the period when he's a member of the Surrealist group. This is the period also of his greatest success as an actor on stage and screen. Right, he's in Abel Gantz's Napoleon, that's filmed in 1925 and released in 1927. He's in The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, by Carl Dreyer. So Artaud is successful and known in these areas. And this is often the Artaud that we sort of think about. This is the one that, this image of him as an artist and kind of cultural intellectual stays with us. And, and rightly rightly so. It's an era of great, it's a decade rather of great success. His film roles are indelible, and also great contention. We're going to talk about his expulsion from the Surrealist group a little bit later. But this is really it's the formative period of Artaud's life when he's doing, let's say, doing well in a recognized way. At the end of that decade, after the expulsion from the Surrealist group, he founds the Alfred Jarry Theater, and he attempts to sort of branch out on his own rather than being dependent on roles created or sponsored by other people, and trouble sets in. In terms of Artaud's addiction, he is first given laudanum in 1919, and he has a deepening addiction problem throughout the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, his addiction is serious enough to have destroyed the most significant romantic relationship of his life and to put his professional career into to difficult straits. But again, we'll say more about that later. So that's the 1920s. In the 1930s, Artaud's work deepens and changes. And this is the period that I am most interested in, that we are going to be most interested in this class. And seeing the 1930s as a kind of a unit, I think is helpful in his work, in understanding his work. Seeing its continuities and discontinuities with the previous era is important. Again, Artaud's work evolves. It looks very similar if we sort of flip through the pages of it. His tone is powerful throughout, but his interests and the things that he's grappling with change. And so a great deal more could be said about this. We are going to focus on the journey to Mexico. But another way to do this would be to focus on the major works that he produced during this period. So this is the period when his theatrical and film work kind of recedes. His last roles on stage and screen happened in 1935. Even though he was writing his most powerful manifestos about the theater in this same period. But what we see here is a moment in which he's grappling with themes and ideas that I've already discussed to a certain extent across a variety of different works and forms, but nevertheless on the same sort of central spine of investigation. So typically we think about Artaud and the influence of the theater and its double, right? There's a collection of manifestos and letters that he wrote between 1931 and really late 1935. He edited it for publication in 1937 following his return from Mexico, and it was finally published in 1938. I see a hand, but I'm going to continue with this thing that I'm saying right now, and then we will get to that. So nevertheless, we think of Artaud, and the major work that we think of is the theater at its double, this collection of manifestos. And he says it's the most important work that he's been doing, but it's not the only work that he was doing at that time. There's also the poetic novel, Heliogabalus, which has recently been released in a new English translation that I'm going to plug because it's actually the same English translation that happened 20 years ago, but it's a nice new edition. Heliogabalus is a historical novel about a Roman emperor that Artaud finds to reflect his themes. And so it's a very strange work. He writes it in 1933 and it's published in 1934. So it's effectively in the middle of the theater and its double. But as a historical novel, it's a very different kind of beast. Artaud effectively inhabits the character of Heliogabalus, like an actor would, to write his poetic story. But the themes that he explores in the book are the ones that I was talking about earlier. The theme of the relationship between the mind, the body, culture, the earth, and the search for meaning. So it's a strange work. But again, it's a historical work. So the way I think of this is to say that Heliogabalus is a historical investigation of the themes that Artaud will investigate in the present in his journey to Mexico. So they're directly related to one another, almost like panels in a diptych or triptych if you include if you're going to include theater in its double. The final work in this period is, of course, his book, The New Revelations of Being, which he writes in the summer of 1937, just before his disastrous trip to Ireland and his internment. That book is going to be very important because it's written sort of on the other side of his search for meaning. In The New Revelations of Being, he has a way that he thinks that the world is shot through with meaning, and he's discovering that meaning and revealing that meaning to others. In any case, what I'm saying here is that the 1930s can be read as a unit of a search for meaning in a religious way that is historical, theatrical, poetic, and visionary, and that these works should be read together, even though the Mexico elements are sort of the focus of our thing today. And I should also say about the Mexico materials that they don't exist in a unified and finished form the way that the other materials do. So we're grappling with a failed heap of manuscript in this class, rather than something that's complete. But nevertheless, let me go back to the hand that was up. There was a question, a comment.
Hi, Stuart. Hi, everybody. Sorry to interrupt you.
Please interrupt, please.
I just wanted to get an idea of what was Artaud's age around 1920.
Oh, yes, that's a good point. So Artaud is born in, he's born in 1896. So, so he's 20 years old in 1916, and that puts him in, he's 30 years old when he's expelled from the Surrealist group. And that means that he's 40 years old by the time that he's making his journey to Mexico. He, of course, dies in 1948 when he's only 51 years old. So it's a foreshortened life for reasons that are more or less obvious. But he's a figure of, let's say, relative young age, but I don't know what else we might want to say about that. So other figures that are in that same generation, obviously, Andre Breton, the founder of the Surrealist group, is born in the same year. So Artaud and Breton are the same age. Georges Bataille was born in 1897, so he is a year younger, but the same age. Other members of the Surrealist group might be, a few years younger than that, but the Artaud is very much that generation. That he's in his 20s, in the 20s, or in his late 20s.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other biographical things on this point before I go back?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And please throw the hand up, interrupt. I can just keep talking forever. And partly that's why we're here, but also we're here so that your interest can drive where this conversation goes. I'm seeing this as a conversation, but it's pretty one-sided so far. So we need to try and break that wall in whatever way we can. But nevertheless, yeah, Ivan.
I have a more general question that perhaps I could have asked earlier. Are there, so this collection of those Mexica related texts of Artaud exists only in English, right? So it's not collected in French.
Well, so the way that it works, and the stated more precisely, is to say that this collection is the only place where you can find it in one volume. And that means a lot. So if you're looking for these materials in the French originals, you have to look across 4 or maybe 5 volumes of the œuvre complète. So just due to the way that his œuvre complète was edited and assembled, and there'll be more to say about this theme later, but yeah, it's the only place where you can get it in one volume. So what you get when you're reading Artaud in some of these other collections is a very strange picture. This, for example, this is a paperback of just the material on the Tarahumara. If you read only the material on the Tarahumara, which is less than half of the material in our collection, then you don't understand why he went there. You don't understand what he said in those lectures in Mexico, who he was, what brought him to this place. Instead, all you see are the experiences of, he calls it the peyote dance, even though it's not really that. You get a very skewed view of who Artaud is. There's another collection called Revolutionary Messages, which is a large portion of the material here. That's the material published mostly in newspapers and journals in Mexico. If you just read the Revolutionary Messages, it again presents you with a very skewed and strange view of who Artaud is and what he was doing there. You don't know what led him there. You don't know what his experience was like there, because Revolutionary Messages doesn't include any of the letters that he wrote to, friends and collaborators, colleagues, to talk about why he was going or the help that he needed or anything. So you get a sense of his cultural criticism, but you don't get a sense of the person that that is writing that criticism, which I think is a very important way to think about it. So what this book does is it gives us each one of these different panels in a single place where you have to search for them in other places, in other ways. Now, in Spanish, you can get a book that collects Revolutionary Messages and the Tarahumara, but again, that has none of the letters. So you don't really see who he was going there. It also doesn't have any of the writings that came before. So the preparatory materials, the things he wrote in France before going to Mexico. A similar volume is available in German as well. So, and I believe in Italian also. So you can get this material, but to get it in this place that has got the cultural criticism, the sort of pseudo-ethnography, as well as the personal drama, this is the only place that it appears, which again is quite strange to me. And there are historical reasons for that. But let's get some other voices in here before I say anything about that. Who wants to go? Someone?
Hello, Stuart. Yeah, I'm Pradeep. You mentioned once that there was a significant romantic relationship that ended for Artaud, which led to like a professional breakdown. I was just wondering, like, since a question, like a biographical question of what was the age of Artaud during that point, and did it also, in some sense, affect his decision, let's say conscious or not, or yearning to go to Mexico at large?
Well, the relationship that I mentioned was with the actress Jenica Athanasiou, who she was a very, I don't know, she was a successful film actress in the 1920s and stage actress. Artaud had met her as when they shared the stage in a theatrical company in the early 1920s, and they had a significant relationship for about 6 years. So it was his longest lasting and deepest romantic relationship. He had others, but that was the longest lasting one. And we have a volume collecting the letters that they exchanged with one another, or that Artaud wrote to her, rather. And so we understand the depth of his feeling about that. But as the letters progress, we see him deepening into his addiction, and we see her growing tired of dealing with his addiction and problems. So the relationship sort of reaches a peak in the mid-1920s, but by 1928, it is effectively over. So that's almost a decade before he goes to Mexico, and I think should be seen as part of the the kind of the beginning of the end of that period in the 1920s when he's in that first, flush of professional success. At that point, he's expelled from the Surrealist group. His roles, that's the peak of his film stardom, but it's also the beginning of the end in other ways. The Alfred Jarry Theater is going to struggle. It's founded 2 years earlier, but it's going to limp along for the next 2 years. So it's a period in which many things are sort of failing for Artaud. There will be, let's say, romantic motivations and sort of implications in his journey to Mexico. For example, his relationship with Anais Nin. He meets Anais Nin, the writer of Cuban origin who lived in France and Paris, later in the United States. His relationship with Anais Nin happened in 1933 when he was writing Heliogabalus and giving his lecture on theater and the plague at the Sorbonne. So Nin writes about that. Nin had written a book about D.H. Lawrence that had recently, at that point, been published. D.H. Lawrence, of course, had gone to Mexico. So Artaud and Nin could talk about Mexico through D.H. Lawrence, cultural change, and we can easily see how the two of them would have been interested in one another and how that might have fueled his interest in going to Mexico. Their relationship, however, was complicated to say the least. This is a period when Artaud's addiction is severe, and Nin is turned off by him. She characterizes the notion of kissing him as like kissing death. And so we have to think about him. He's a laudanum addict, and laudanum is a purple syrup. So his teeth are stained deep purple. So he's not exactly a romantic hero in 1934. But he doesn't go to Mexico just for that. It's just part of the overall ecology. Georgia.
Hi, I've got 3 questions.
Great.
The first one was, did Artaud speak Spanish?
No.
Right, okay, important question.
Yes.
So who was he hanging out with when he
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a question that we'll probably come back to us later, but it's a very important one, right? I mean, he goes to Mexico and does not speak Spanish. He had friends in Paris that had set him up with some contacts that he could use, and that was his entrance point into Mexico. And so basically on his journey over, and again we can say more about this later, but on his journey over, he takes the boat. The boat stops in Havana for a week or so, and then he continues on to Mexico City. And he's in Mexico City from February 2nd until August. While he's there, he's hanging out with people who speak French. So he gives lectures in French. He writes articles in French. Those articles are translated into Spanish by a group of, some are well known, others are obscure, but poets and intellectuals that meet this guy. And this is a thing that we definitely want to think about later. Who greet Artaud as a famous actor of stage and screen, a member of the Surrealist group. He's an emissary of the European avant-garde. So people in Mexico are like, oh, Artaud, great. They're thrilled to meet him. But he is utterly dependent on, he's dependent on many, he's dependent on other people. He's dependent on their translations of his work, and he's dependent on their ability to help him negotiate. This becomes even more significant as a problem when we think about whether or not he actually reached the Sierra Tarahumara. The story, and again, we're going to talk about this in greater detail, but the story is, of course, that he did go, that he got a grant to sponsor his trip, but speaking Spanish even there does not help you, because
Well,
you need to be able to speak indigenous languages, and so the story is that he had a Spanish-speaking interpreter who could help him. But this again is a major problem in understanding how Artaud could have, first of all, been welcomed into that community, and then included in their rights. If he could not understand a thing that they were saying, if his experience was utterly dependent on translation the entire time, how could he know what was going on? Where would he get this language? And to let a little bit of this story out in advance, Artaud's writings about the Tarahumara owe a great deal to pre-existing ethnographic treatments, which is to say, plagiarism. We can see that Artaud obviously read ethnographic writing about the Tarahumara and the peyote dance, and he borrowed from it. He borrowed structure, language, image. It's plagiarism. If a student did that, they would fail the course. And yet we're reading Artaud's writings that do that, almost 100 years later. So yeah, he does not speak Spanish, and it's a significant thing.
What do we know about the deterioration of his mental health specifically during this time?
This is a major theme for our discussion.
Okay.
Right. So just the short answer to that is, I think that we can see that deterioration in the texts themselves, and that's something that I want to talk about a little bit more later today. But it's a thing that we want to look for. Reading Artaud, and I'm going to say this again, but reading Artaud is often this question of the critical or the clinical, right? To borrow terms from Deleuze. Which lens do we use for understanding him? Do we just interpret it as though this is a collection of signs written by a poet? Or do we diagnose it? Do we use these writings as a method as a diagnostic object? Do we chart his madness in there? And so when you're reading Heliogabalus, written in 33, you see a poet at the height of his powers. His search for metaphor, his command of language is extraordinary. When you're reading The New Revelations of Being, 1937, you are, you're in the company of a mind on the cusp. So that's a thing that we need to grapple with. When is it madness? And that's an important question for us, because I think we can be broadly sympathetic to Artaud's goals on this journey, right? He went to Mexico trying to do things that I think we can admire. He's trying to create an ecological vision of culture. But what happened to him there, and the extent to which that goal itself might be evidence of madness, is something that should give us pause. So as we read, we will see that. We'll see that unfold, and have to think about what it means, and then how he got himself out of that. Question 3, though. You had 3?
Yeah, that's it. No, that was it. Did he speak Spanish? Who was he hanging out with, and how stable was he at the time?
Okay, good.
Sorry, can I add something to that? So we don't have any sort of commentary from some people that knew him about what he was like.
You mean in Mexico?
Yeah, exactly. We don't have someone being like, that guy's crazy. Like,
no. We of course we yes, we absolutely have that. Yeah. So and this is a sort of another problematic element to this story, that Artaud becomes a legend in this. This is a legendary journey. That's part of why we're here talking about it. And then again, this is one of those things that his editor in French, Paul Thévenin, says that the more years pass, the more people come forward claiming to have met Artaud in Mexico. Sort of the further away we get, the more people say they were there, they remember him that day, that he was, I was just a young man, but he was there. I was a little boy, but he was there. Or, I hung out with him. I scored drugs with Artaud in Chapultepec Park. Like these stories circulate around the legend of Artaud in Mexico. And so how many of them are we to believe? That there could be a fantastic collection, and there is to some extent, but most biographers on this point tend to kind of pick a line and they say, well, there's this story and then there's this story, and then we can say this is the truth of what happened to Artaud. But I dream of a different kind of writing about about Artaud in Mexico, which collects all of these true and false and misleading dreams of Artaud in Mexico, because they're all part of the legend. So we do have a great deal of that. And it's very difficult to parse. Which one do we want to believe? To what extent do we want to believe it? In this class, we're going to highlight a little bit of that, but because we're not interested in secondary sources, we're not spending a lot of time on it. I talk about it in the book, in the introduction and in the notes, but it's not something that we're going to read in this class. But if you're interested, there's a lot of very strange tales about Artaud, and there's things to think about that. Like, does it matter? Is a big question. Does it matter if he visited the Tarahumara? And that's a question we're going to have to ask ourselves later in the class. Does it matter if those stories are true? Which ones do we need to be true, and which ones are not helpful for them to be true? So what is the real and what is the fake? Where is meaning? That's part of the drama of Artaud that we have to think about here. There were a couple other questions, though, I think. There's somebody else? No? What time is it? Yeah. Nobody else right now? Okay, so I'll go back to sort of this narrative that I had going, and then we can turn to some of the deeper questions that are inspired by the readings that I had for today. So basically, I was suggesting that the work from the 1930s can be read as a kind of big unit in this search for meaning, and it's the drama of spirit or mind and matter. It's the drama of consciousness. It's the journey toward madness, as we were saying just a second ago. So there's a lot to think about then, but nevertheless, he gets back to France at the end of 1936. By November, he's back in France. The next year is going to be extremely complicated for him because of this question of madness. He's extremely erratic. He has no money. He's back on drugs, which he's constantly struggling with his addiction. He edits the materials for the theater in its double in the spring of 1937, so that book can be published. He hoped soon, because he has no money. He's sleeping on park benches, on people's couches. He's homeless and impoverished and addicted to drugs. So there are many more things that happened to him in 1937, but it culminates in a trip to Ireland, which is a kind of reboot of the goals of his trip to Mexico, but closer to home. Mexico was a trip far, far away, very much elsewhere. His trip to Ireland has the same goal. He's looking at people, place, symbolic meaning. And he's particularly interested in Celtic culture. So he wants to get underneath Europe, underneath the history of Europe. But his journey to Ireland results in his utter breakdown into madness, which is to say that he is picked up in Dublin for disturbing the peace. He's returned to France. There's an altercation on the boat as he's coming back, and he spends the next 8 years and 8 months in a series of 4 different mental institutions. This, of course, is the period of World War II. and the Vichy government, the Nazi occupiers at first, and then Vichy are going to impose effectively starvation diets on people in long-term care facilities. So that's Artaud. All his teeth are going to fall out. He is, it's a terrible experience. Now we should say about this period, some people like to say that Artaud is merely, what do I want to say? I would say some people make light of Artaud's madness. They act as though it is not quite a serious thing. However, if you read the letters and spells that he wrote during those 8 years and 8 months, you see the extent to which he suffered deeply. He renounced his name. He refused to recognize the name Antonin Artaud, and he went by a series of different names for many years. So it was quite real and quite difficult for him. Ultimately, he's transferred to an asylum in the south of France in Vichy, in a place called Rodez. And when he's at Rodez, he has two very different experiences. One is a series of electroshock treatments, which are traumatic for him, to say the least. And we can say more about that if we want, but electroshock treatments. But alongside that, art, what we would today call art therapy. Dr. Fergier, his psychiatrist, encourages him to write and to draw, to translate, to engage with the wider world. And this brings Artaud out. And by May of 1946, he is released. He, through the support of friends and different things, he's able to return to Paris, where he has the final moment of his life and career, which is enormously successful in terms of the amount of material that he generates. He gives a few final performances. I'm going to just gloss this very quickly. He gives a few final performances, including his recording of To Have Done with the Judgment of God for the radio. He exhibits his drawings in a gallery. He publishes a series of books of various kinds of books of letters. His material in Tarahumara is re-released as a book. He's very much created as a heroic figure of the avant-garde of a previous era. His work changes focus, though. It's no longer about that cultural search for meaning. It's much more intimate in terms of becoming a different kind of body, to remake his body. So that post-Rodez period, bleeding into his experience there, has a different focus than either the broad focus of his artistic and cultural endeavors in the 20s or his investigations in the 1930s. It's very much a fourth period, including the time of his asylum internment as another period. So again, I'm seeing Artaud in these different moments, and again, we are focusing on that sort of middle period, the 1930s, when he's looking for these things. What this means is that if you pick up a book by Artaud that includes writings from the entire span of his career, you're going to find a very different set of problems in each one of these periods, even though the core kind of view of the world is broadly similar, his experience is broadly similar, but nevertheless, profound differences. So we need to be attentive to all of that. Now, of course, Artaud dies, as I mentioned, March 4th, 1948. He had terminal rectal cancer, which he had been suffering from for a few years, and that would have killed him, within months. He nevertheless died of drug overdose. He was taking immense quantities of chlorohydrate, which he was not familiar with. So it's easy to see how he would have, accidentally overdosed at that period. What else do we want to say about his biography? Are there any other sort of biographical questions before we circle back and dive into the actual thing I want to talk about today? Yeah, go ahead. Somebody. James.
Sorry, was there someone else? James?
Yeah, you can go ahead if you want those,
No, no, please, I'll go after you.
All right. I just have a couple of questions. First of all, you said that there's a certain sort of strain of thought which doesn't take his madness seriously at a certain point. What do people read that as instead? What's their interpretation if he's not genuinely insane?
Well, so this is a big question, you know, in the interpretation of the work, and I would say that it has several major strains. So there are some people who want to draw a sort of loose linkage between madness and creativity, and they want to say that every poet is a bit mad. And this sort of downplays the severity of Artaud's experience and of his dissociation and psychosis. So there's that level of it. However, there's also just a celebration of madness that we see, in a different way, that we see, for example, in the recuperation of Artaud's work by, for example, the Beat Generation in the United States. So someone like Allen Ginsberg, and in the United States, we had this anthology. It's called Artaud Anthology that was published by City Lights Books in 1965, and it skewed toward a certain reading of Artaud that highlighted his time in mental institutions, his experience and suffering of electroshock, his drug use, his interest in Mexico. It presents, it uses Artaud to advance the causes of this Beat Generation reading and celebration of cultural rebellion and exoticism and other things like that. So there's that celebration of Artaud's madness. And then at another level, we could even put Deleuze and Guattari's use of Artaud in Anti-Oedipus into a kind of continuity with a certain sort of, I don't know if, downplaying. People have been very critical of Deleuze and Guattari for their celebration of schizophrenia. And so that is an enormous conversation to be had, the extent to which they celebrate schizophrenia. They use Artaud to promote this schizophrenic interpretation of the world. And that too is in continuity with a reading of or a recuperation of Artaud by the sort of anti-psychiatry movement. So here, R.D. Laing is the main proponent of that. So you can put it across this kind of spectrum in different countries, different periods for different reasons. But each one of those things, or each one of those readings, in my view, downplays the absolute severity of Artaud's experience, which I think we need to maintain if we're going to understand who he is and grapple with the solutions and strategies that he used to accommodate his real mental suffering, his life of pain.
Right, thank you.
Where I want to go. Yeah.
That was a great answer. Thank you. I guess my other question, when he's in Ireland, he doesn't speak Gaelic or English, is that right?
His English is very poor.
Right.
So he did speak some English, but not in a useful manner. So it's a similar thing to what he's experienced in Mexico. And yeah, exactly.
And maybe I just missed this, but how long was he in Ireland for?
He was in Ireland for about 4 weeks or so. I'm forgetting the exact dates, but it's effectively September of 1937.
Sure.
So I think he leaves maybe the end of August, and then he leaves France, and then he gets thrown out of Ireland in like September 23rd or something along those lines. I guess we just missed an anniversary of that. If it's a thing to celebrate.
Thank you. I'll pass on to Train now.
Yeah. Another comment.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit about his diagnosis, his mental diagnosis, and that sort of if there is some documentation or if he's also aware of if he has a sort of a meta position towards what's happening to him, and if he maybe is accelerating it through drug use intentionally in a conscious way, or I mean, so kind of his diagnosis and self-diagnosis maybe, and his drug, because many users like and his family. I'm really curious, what was his incubator like? What was his familiar, like his mother, his father? What environment did he grow up in? I just want to kind of get because he has such a charged existence that I'm curious if that sort of it was inherited from some reverberations from his family, or
right. Yeah. So that's a good transition into where we want to go in the sort of the next phase of this. And we've got way too much material as usual. But where I want to go into the next phase of this is to talk about what I'm calling the body in pain. And this is the stuff I asked you to read, the description of a physical state from selected writings. And then also those 2 articles on addiction or, drug legislation that are also in selected writings. And so I want to situate that, this is the kind of questions you're asking. They're at the core of Artaud's goals as an artist, but also as a revolutionary. And the kind of cultural change that he is seeking is also personal change. And so that's the thing that we want to explore, for the next bit here. But what is this body in pain? So Artaud, and to kind of lump these 2 things together, evidence suggests that he had a hereditary form of syphilis that he contracted from his father. So his father had this, he had it, and that contributed to a diagnosis in his youth of what they then called neurasthenia, which we would call today sort of complex of things related to anxiety. So neurasthenia in the 19th century and early 20th century includes a number of different symptoms from, again, what we would just sort of recognize as anxiety, but also stuff like fatigue and headaches, broadly depression, and a group of those kinds of things. This was stuff that Artaud suffered from increasingly in his adolescence. He had meningitis when he was about 4 years old, and so that may have contributed to sort of his self-understanding and his family's understanding of him as a fragile child. He stuttered as a child. So he had a number of things, he grew up in Marseille. He had a number of things that were, let's say, stacked against him or, contributed to that. This diagnosis of neurasthenia, though, led him into his first series of stays in rest homes, in places that we don't quite have places like this now. It's not a mental institution like he would be in later, but it's a place where one would go and retreat from the world. So retreat from the demands and noises of everyday life, to get out of that. So Artaud was in and out of these these cures from 1915 to 1920. He was in them for a few months, and then he would come out. He was briefly in the military, but could not do, during World War I, but, obviously could not do that with this anxiety. It, it just could not happen. So he was hypersensitive, hyper aware, and the entirety of his life is this kind of pendulum swinging. I mean, his consciousness is this pendulum swinging between hyper awareness and sedation, drug addiction. He appeals to opiates as a way to avoid hypersensitivity. And of course, he becomes an opium addict in a medical context. He's prescribed laudanum in 1919 by a doctor when he's staying at one of these clinics as treatment for anxiety. So he's not buying drugs on the street in 1919. He's in a clinic being treated for anxiety, and that is an important thing to emphasize and to think about as we sort of move forward. But nevertheless, what I'm talking about here is this sensitivity to the body, to the world, to all manner of things, and it's at the core of his creative work in the 1920s and throughout his life. But it's at the origin of his success as an artist and a writer. So his first important book is the correspondence with Jacques Rivière. Jacques Rivière is the editor of the Nouvelle Revue Française, so the most important journal of arts and letters in France in the 1920s. Artaud sends him some poems accompanied by letters. Rivière rejects the poems and says these are not good. Artaud responds and says, I'm sorry, I can't write good poems. And they then enter into correspondence about this, in which Artaud explains why he can't write good poems. And he can't because of the erosion of his consciousness. He says the defects of form, and this is on Selected Writings, page 34. The defects of form follow from a central collapse of the soul, a kind of erosion, both essential and fleeting, of thought. Something destroys my thought. So that kind of clinical problem, that diagnosable problem, is related to his success and his talent, and his ability to describe what he is experiencing is his greatest talent as a writer. People call him a cartographer of the soul, and that's one of the things that makes him so incredible to read, particularly those early pieces. It's just these like I said, the description of his physical state. I asked you to read that section again from Selected Writings. This is on page 64 of Selected Writings. He says there's a sharp burning sensation in the limbs, muscles twisted as if flayed, the sense of being made of glass and breakable, a fear, a recoiling from movement and noise, an unconscious confusion of walking, gestures, movements, a will that's perpetually straining to make the simplest gestures, a renunciation of simple gestures, a staggering and central fatigue, a kind of gasping fatigue. Movements must be recomposed, a sort of death-like fatigue, a fatigue of the mind in carrying out the simplest muscular contraction. He goes on like this this is a few pages. But really, he goes on like this for hundreds, if not thousands of pages in his notebooks from the end of his life. The end of this instantaneous classification of things in the cells of the mind, not so much in their logical order as in their emotional or affective order. Things which have no odor, no more sex, but their logical order is also sometimes broken precisely because of the lack of emotional aroma. Words rot at the unconscious summons of the brain. All the words for a kind of mental operation, and especially those operations which affect the most habitual, most active responses of the mind. This is a text that he wrote in 1924, published in the Umbilicus of Limbo. It's it's a text we associate with his period of membership in the Surrealist group. And looking at this kind of thing, I would argue that he's a kind of natural surrealist, right? The Surrealist group is interested in rebellion against all forms of authority, but also the expansion of the realms of creativity, the liberation of the imagination, the recuperation of the residue and results of dreams and unconscious motivations. Artaud's unstable mental state is ideal for that kind of an agenda. He's like almost organically predisposed to membership in the Surrealist group. Similarly, his use of drugs fits into the Surrealist rebellion against forms of social control. So it's like a perfect meeting of an individual with their pathologies and propensities, their addictions and desires, and a cultural milieu and space. He doesn't necessarily choose to be a surrealist. He's fated to be a surrealist, in a certain way. And there's sort of more to say about that. But again, what are we reading there? Like that description of physical state, we can read it as a surrealist text and this liberation of the unconscious, this attentiveness to consciousness in its nuances. So we can read it as surrealism. We can read it in the legacy of Rimbaud and Baudelaire. It's very easy to put him in that legacy when we read a text like that. But at the same time, that is a description of physical state. He could have written that at a in the intake form when he's visiting a mental health practitioner. What's wrong with you? Well, this is what's wrong with me. Words rot. Meaning is lost. So again, critical, clinical, symptoms or signs. How do we read a text like that? And this notion that his creative process is bound up with this very real physical sensation, and mental, of course. But there's a question, Joao.
Yeah, in the in the end of this text, he refers a painting by André Masson. Do we have an idea which painting it is?
We do know which painting it is, but I don't have it written down right here. I have a picture of it though, I think. Yeah, so to be clear, that's not the same text. The description of physical state is just the description ending with that paragraph, words rot. Then there's a break of a few lines, and then there's a description of the painting by Masson. Which is this. It's called L'Homme. And so again, Artaud and Masson are great friends, and I want to say more about that in a few minutes. But for now, I want to stay close to this to make sure we understand the reality of his mental suffering. Was that the extent of the question for now? Yeah. So what else do I want to say about that? Oh yes, going back to our broad theme about Artaud's madness and that question. So again, one thing I'm saying is that he had this neurasthenia that impacted his life, his creativity, his sensitivity, his hyper-awareness. It's a thing that he wrote about. It's a thing that motivated his addiction to a large extent. But then, obviously, his madness in later life takes on a different turn, right? So he lived with that addiction and kind of anxiety up until the end of 1937. And in 1937, with his trip to Ireland, he collapses into a state of psychotic delirium, wherein he believes that he's being attacked by demons at all times. And so that sense of demonic possession, of demons entering into his body, when he's in the asylums, in Rodez in particular, he develops these forms of chanting and spitting and gestural, jerking behavior, which he uses to fight off demons. So this is a very different kind of mental illness than anxiety or neurasthenia. We can see a kind of continuity to it, but there's a break there. And it's a psychotic breakdown with reality. And again, we're gonna chart that. So I'm saying that there's this kind of relationship, and we need to keep these things in mind, right? Artaud and Rodez has a very different sense of mental debility than Artaud in the Surrealist group. But there's a continuity to it, It's one thing to celebrate his sensitivity as a poet in the 1920s, but he's doing something else in the 1940s. So, I don't know. Thoughts, comments on that? Let's think about his drug addiction, though. And I've got way too much to say, as usual. So I've already mentioned that his drug addiction begins in a medical context, right? 1919. I asked you to read two of his earlier writings from 1920s on the legalization of opiates. So one thing to say about this is that when we're thinking about drug use, and here I'm using this moment as a sort of introduction to part of the things that Artaud is going to be thinking about throughout his life, and that are going to come back for us when we think about peyote at the end on our fourth week here. When we're thinking about drug use, we need to think about different types of drugs, right? Because not all drugs are the same drugs. We need to think about context of use, because not every context is the same. And there's a lot to say about all of this, which we don't have to go into now, but we do need to keep these things in mind, right? So broadly speaking, we could talk about sedatives, stimulants, and hallucinogens as three broad categories of drugs. And of course, there are many others, but sedatives, stimulants, and hallucinogens. Artaud isn't, he's addicted to sedatives, right? Opium. He wants a downer. He wants to go down and out. He's not addicted to stimulants. He doesn't write about taking stimulants like cocaine. This is not what interests him. He doesn't need more reality. He needs less reality. This is also to say that peyote, which is a hallucinogen, right? The active principle or element of peyote, the molecule is mescaline. Peyote is a hallucinogen. It is not a sedative. It's something completely different. So is Artaud appealing to a different class of drug in taking peyote? Or is he interested in something else entirely? These are questions that we're going to ask later. But I want to emphasize them now to say that he's not an indiscriminate drug taker. He is doing things, for a reason, that are related to his sensitivities and his consciousness. And so, he's a guy that he's going to go to Mexico in search of rituals. He's interested in cultural contexts. And that really matters when we're thinking about drug use, right? So again, he takes drugs first in a medical context. His addiction sends him beyond that context, so that, yes, he is taking illegal opiates by the end of the 1920s, certainly throughout the 1930s, and absolutely when he's in Mexico. But it's also something that destroyed his life. And so we need to keep that in mind. I've already mentioned how it had a negative impact on his romantic relations in the 20s, how it made it very difficult for him to work. He needed money to support his addiction, and this led him to be, sleeping on couches and in the park, on benches. There was almost no amount of money that would feed his addiction, and this happened repeatedly throughout his entire life, even at the end, after Rodez. The letters that he writes from Rodez and from the other asylums are filled with him begging friends to bring him heroin. So he is someone who is a desperate addict, and whose addiction destroyed his life. But his use of these drugs coincides with a historical period that is interesting in this way, right? So we have to think about Artaud's drug use against a background of the kind of legislation of drug use. So here in the United States, the Federal Drug Administration was created in 1906. Narcotics like opium and its derivatives were first legislated or controlled in 1914. So these are things that happened during Artaud's lifetime. Meanwhile, at the same time, you've got avant-garde groups. So the Surrealists and Artaud's writings are at the center of this. And other avant-garde groups like Le Grand Jeu in France, but others elsewhere. In England, you have Yeats, for example, the poet, taking drugs. You have a broad interest in the use of drugs as an escape from everyday reality. And so we need to think about what I'm saying there. We have this kind of profane experience of seemingly meaningless existence. And in response to that, we do many things. We do many things to avoid the emptiness of life. And drugs are one of those things. And as I said, there are those three ways to respond. You can say, I want to do a downer and get out of here. I want to go down and out. We can say, I want to, I can respond to the boredom and meaninglessness of the world with a stimulant. I can say, I need more of this. Life like this is terrible. I need more. Stimulant. Or we can say, I need to go elsewhere. Hallucinogen. I can explore a visionary and altered state of consciousness. So each one of those three classes of drugs is a response to a similar condition of reality, but under different contexts, with different goals, and in different ways. And so that's the thing that Artaud is going to be grappling with, and writing about throughout his life. And we need to assess how that kind of plays out. In terms of I don't necessarily want to spend too much time on this, but the letter to the legislator of the law on narcotics that he writes in the context of the Surrealist group. He says, the law on narcotics places in the hands of the inspector usurper of public health the right to have control over human suffering. It's a pretension peculiar to modern medicine to try to dictate to the individual conscience or consciousness. All the bleedings of the official charter are powerless against this phenomena of consciousness, namely, that I am the master of my pain. even more than my death. Every man is the judge and the exclusive judge of the quantity of physical suffering or mental emptiness that he can honestly stand. So again, Artaud's interest in drugs is rooted in physical and mental suffering. His rebellion against control, state control, regulation, legislation, is motivated by this will to gather into his own powers, his ability to deal with that pain. Whether I am lucid or not, there's a lucidity which no sickness will ever take from me, and that's the lucidity which dictates to me the sense of my physical life. So Artaud's, it's about his body and his mind. It's about pain. So it fits into the broad surrealist project of rebellion and rejection of social norms, but it's rooted in a very personal experience, and that's quite important. What else do we want to say about that? I don't know. Are there thoughts, questions? Yeah. M.A.
Hello, Stuart and everyone. I wonder if it is possible to locate Artaud's readings on the Vedic and Tibetan culture and all these tantric traditions. And I wonder if did he practice kind of meditation, or it was more like an approach of a theoretical and symbolic interest, but not necessarily into this kind of, because he is very kind of influenced by this idea of suffering that you see in Buddhism. And I wonder if it is possible to locate this chronologically and to maybe do a parallel of this idea of liberation and getting out of this body of pain that.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. That's the where it comes from, and that's his entire motivation. I'm not sure how many of these letters are actually in this collection, but in 1931, as Artaud's addiction had deepened and his world had essentially collapsed in terms of his professional life, collapse of the Alfred Jarry Theater, his other projects. This is when he turns to acupuncture and Chinese medicine more broadly as an alternative way to heal his pain. He had been interested, as you say, in all manner of writings from the world religions, but at this moment it becomes deeply motivational, and so we're going to see that play out across the texts from Mexico with a great subtlety and intensity. Artaud is very much motivated by using those religious traditions and framings of the world for homeopathic and medical purposes. He's a man in pain, and he wants to heal himself with whatever tools, philosophical, religious, practical, or otherwise, that he can. And so it grows directly out of that. And that's extremely important to remember. I'll see if there are some of these letters, but his interest in all of this is shared by his friend Renee Allende, who is a doctor. Renee's wife Yvonne was part of the organizing committee for the Alfred Jarry Theater, but Renee Allende wrote about Paracelsus and alchemical tradition, but also, he's a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and he's interested in homeopathic and other remedies. And he's a great friend, to a certain extent, of Artaud's. Artaud considers him a great friend, and there are letters to the Allendes in the book. Renee Allende takes a certain distance from Artaud because of Artaud's suffering and his you know, the extremes of his behavior. But you know, Allende is the one who let Artaud speak on theater and the plague at the Sorbonne, for example. All I'm saying here, in answer to your question, is that the answer is yes. That his turn towards all those ideologies and his appeal to the alchemical tradition, Hermeticism, all of that stems from this question of the body in pain. So on the one hand, sort of Western secular drug use, it looks like what we would see in that model, but also, you know, kind of Chinese medicine, and all that. These are things that we're gonna chart as we move through the, you know, the weeks here, and as we read, you know, what he's doing. So on the one hand, I don't want to say too much about that today, because what we want to do is see how that is there on the margins of the writings that we'll read over the coming weeks. Again, that's a thing that's, I think, unfairly neglected in the appreciation or interpretation of Artaud's works. If we put him in a secular bucket, he's a mere artist. But if we put him in this other, you know, space, then he's a mystic. But they're united because it's a body and consciousness in pain. Were there other thoughts on these two writings on narcotics from the 1920s? This is a thing that he's going to continue to write about. And, you know, I guess as a sort of final remark on this right now, I just want to say that, again, we can read that as a kind of surrealist rebellion, you know, a text of rebellion against social control. We can say, surrealists want the state to leave me alone. And that's true. But we should remember that his core motivation is psychological and physical and, you know, deeply personal. It's got to do with illness and pain. You know, so it's not just a freedom for freedom's sake. It's freedom for the sake of his own health. If health is maybe not quite the right word. But, all right, so I'm not sure how far we're going to get. We've got some time. I do want to talk about Surrealism and revolution as it's related to this, and then I might maybe we'll just rush through this a little bit, and some of it we may have to wait until next week. But effectively, right now, I'm going to switch gears slightly. Again, we're looking at this kind of this orientation. What pushed Artaud to Mexico? Why did he go to Mexico? And how is this related to this notion of revolution? And so in situating this journey, we have to think about Artaud as a surrealist, and that has to do with how he was greeted in Mexico, but also the orientation of his you know, his life as an avant-gardist, let's say. So where do we want to go with that? You know, the Surrealist movement or group was started in 1924. Artaud was a kind of early adopter. He joined effectively in October of 1924. And we should remember that the journals of the Surrealist group, the main journal was called La Révolution Surréaliste. The articles that Artaud published in Mexico were published in a newspaper that was a state-run newspaper called El Nacional Revolucionario. So this notion of revolution is there in his participation in the Surrealist group, and it's also there in the venue of publication for the writings in Mexico. He calls the collection of Mexican writings revolutionary messages, or he dreams of calling it that. And it's revolutionary messages because the place where they were published, the journal, the newspaper, was El Nacional Revolucionario. It's the title of the thing. So they are revolutionary in content, but they are revolutionary in venue. And there's this continuity between La Revolución Surrealista and El Nacional Revolucionario. But again, we need to remember that the Surrealist group is not a unified thing. I've said this before. The Surrealist group had three main factions, and this is a big topic, but it matters. So the central faction, the most important one, is led by André Breton, and it's associated with his address on the Rue Fontaine in Paris. So the central group of Surrealists, and this is like Breton and Éluard and Louis Aragon and folks like that in the 1920s, the core group of people that we think of as Surrealists. They meet at a cafe on the Place Blanche near the Rue Fontaine. But they're not the only Surrealists. The other Surrealist groups are folks that are associated with André Masson, the painter, and his studio on the Rue Blomet. So Artaud meets the people around Masson first. They are his friends. So these are people like Masson himself, Michel Leiris, Georges Bataille. Jean Dubuffet is not a Surrealist, but he is part of this group at that time. Georges Lambour, there are others. And this matters a lot in the, and there's another group that's associated with Jacques Prévert and his apartment on the Rue de Château. So these three main groups of Surrealists, they each have different kind of orientations. And I don't know how much people are interested in this or already know about it, but one way to think about the distinction between the two of them is to think about the fight between André Breton and Georges Bataille over materialism. And this is something that plays out in the Second Surrealist Manifesto. And what we're doing here is associating Artaud and Bataille and André Masson with a certain orientation that has a fundamental interest in materialism and the things of the world. They read Heraclitus and Nietzsche, whereas André Breton is much more of an idealist. So Bataille attacks Breton over his idealism. And that is something that kind of carries out, and we're going to see play out in the investigations of Artaud. Artaud struggles with this idealism, materialism divide between these figures. Artaud is friends with Masson and Bataille and that group, and therefore he's on the material side. But he's in search of meaning. He's deeply concerned with this, the problems of spirit and mind. And so it's a tension within him. What I'm suggesting here is that we can do a reading of Artaud's work, and we'll be doing this over the next several weeks, that pulls out these strands or threads or influences on the Surrealist group. If we just think of Surrealism in the framework of André Breton, then we don't understand Artaud as a Surrealist. To understand Artaud as a Surrealist, we have to understand him in association with Masson, Bataille, and Leiris. These figures are also figures who are much more interested in things like travel, ethnography, and those dramas, which we see play out for Artaud, right? So Michel Leiris, of course, was part of the Dakar-Djibouti expedition from 1931 to 1933, which he chronicled in his journal of that trip called L'Afrique Fantôme. Leiris writes a fundamental reimagining of ethnography and anthropology as a field in France. And he's a friend of Artaud's. So this is something that Artaud in Mexico should be, we should understand him in relationship to that. André Breton, barely travels at all until he's exiled during World War II. He's interested in the marvelous. He is interested in other cultures and in the primitive. But Larice goes there, you know. Artaud goes to Mexico in the same way that Larice went to Africa. Or in relationship to Georges Bataille. And we'll say more about this later. You know, Bataille appeals to myth at the same time, myth and religion, at the same time that Artaud does in the fall of 1935. And so this is a thing we need to really think about. If we had more time, obviously what we would do is we would do Artaud in Mexico, and we would do an investigation of Bataille's work with Acéphale. Acéphale is Bataille's attempt to create a new myth, and Artaud's journey to Mexico is his search for a new myth. So it's surrealism, but it's not just one surrealism. It's different kinds of surrealism. It's surrealist rebellion and revolution, but it's materialist and motivated by different things. So I asked you to read two pieces. One is a 1927 pamphlet called In Total Darkness, or The Surrealist Bluff. And this is a pamphlet that Artaud wrote when he was expelled from the Surrealist group. And the other one that I asked you to read was a lecture that is the first lecture that he delivered in Mexico called Surrealism and Revolution. And what's interesting to me, or one of the things that's interesting about these, is the way that Artaud identifies with surrealism, but also distances himself from it. So there's a complicated, you know, kind of dialectical relationship within each of these texts that is worth tracing. We're primarily interested in it mostly as background here. And I feel like I should need to move very quickly on this point, but in terms of the essay on, or the pamphlet, the Surrealist Bluff, the history of this is, of course, that, well, first, let me ask if there were questions about what I was just saying, about the different factions within surrealism or anything related to that. Does anybody? Yes. Or not?
Actually, I was thinking of Bataille's study of political economy and energy.
Yes.
And I was thinking if like Artaud's psychic libidinal economy, to quote Lyotard, that perhaps he was in his pathologies, he was dealing with a lot of psychic energy that was like somehow too much for him, and that the drugs help to regulate it. And so I was thinking that Bataille's study of energy cuts across a number of thresholds. So from a new materialist point of view, a reading of Artaud's
Yes.
writing and pathologies like could be undertaken or not.
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the things that we are going to be doing over the next 3 weeks. So part of the argument that I'm making is that Bataille and Artaud, and also André Masson and Michel Larice, are all indebted to a certain interpretation of Heraclitus and the way that Heraclitus sees the world as effectively a war of different forces and energies. So we see this in Artaud's writing about Heraclitus. He has a series of notes that he makes on Heraclitus in 1935 before going to Mexico. Those are available in volume 7 of his Œuvre Complète, and they're available in English in a book that also has the New Revelations of Being. So we can talk about that. Anyway, both of them, all of the people influenced by Masson and the Rue Blomet Surrealists have this same view of the world. And what Artaud is effectively doing in Mexico is investigating that Heraclitean interpretation of the world as fire and energy. He's investigating that in Mexico. And what he's doing in that moment is he is trying to figure out how does it work? He's trying to get outside of the European context and experience that Heraclitean, cosmology in its raw form in Mexico. And so this is a thing that Bataille develops in Acéphale, and then he develops in his thinking about political economy and the circulation of energy throughout the universe. So it's effectively one thing, and it's rooted in Heraclitus. On my academia.edu website, I have some writings about this. If you're interested in
Yes.
Bataille, Heraclitus, and all the ways that this works. But we're going to see it playing out over the next several weeks. And we're going to watch the ways that Artaud is trying to find that that interpretation. He's got it from, I'm arguing that he has it essentially from Heraclitus, but he wants to figure out what the gestures are, what the rituals are, what the culture is that goes around it. And that's what Bataille is doing also in Acéphale. He's looking for the culture of expenditure. And really that's what we are doing in this class as well. Georgia.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about something that you said quite close to the beginning. I was wondering because you mentioned that Artaud's writings were published in El Nacional, which was the newspaper run by the PRI, or like what was then the PRN.
Mm-hmm.
So I was interested in what we know about and Artaud got a grant from the Mexican embassy in Paris, right, to go to Mexico?
Yeah, so he got small, what he really got was permission to go.
Right.
And so this means he got a break on his entrance visa. Like they waived the fee for his entrance. So he got things like this. He then got entrusted with a mission from the French legation, and this allowed him to give a lecture at the Alliance Française in Mexico, and he got paid for that. So he kind of cobbled it together. But it's not as though Artaud had any form of stable, grant or income or anything. In Mexico, he lived by writing for that newspaper. And
right. So this is my question, because it's why? Because it's very because of course it's very, very highly politicized. And just to chuck something into the mix, the president at the time was Lázaro Cárdenas, who I didn't know. I literally just read this. Really, really relaxed drug laws in Mexico at the time.
Yes.
So I suppose my question is what was the PRN's stake, and why did Artaud want anything to do with them?
These are questions that we're going to ask over the next couple of weeks rather than today. So I'm gonna punt on that right now, because we want to investigate that very question for 2.5 hours next week, because this is the question. Just who did they think he was? Who did he think they were? What did he think he was getting himself into? And effectively, the short answer is that it was a series of misunderstandings. And so we need to see how those misunderstandings and misguided gestures produce this outcome. But yes, the one thing to say here is that Artaud lived more or less week by week by publishing articles in these papers. And he gave lectures and got paid for the lectures. He published the lectures sometimes in single installments, other times in another one. He published some articles in a newspaper in Havana as well. He had a few other things, but it was primarily in that one paper. And it's not as though he's a front page news, but it was sustaining to a degree if you're not addicted to heroin, So, was there another thought on that? So I do want to say about the Surrealist, the Surrealist bluff article, just to emphasize, this is on page 139 of the selected writings, where he says toward the bottom, the whole root, all the exacerbations of our quarrel, turn on the word revolution. So, Artaud so in 1926, his relationship with the Surrealist group is this moment when communism, Marxism, but really communism supported by the French Communist Party as an extension of the Soviet Union is on the rise in France. And André Breton wants to bring the Surrealist group into line with the French Communist Party. And so they have a meeting of the Surrealist group, and they kind of go around the room and they're saying, who is going to join us in communism? And Artaud says, well, no, I don't believe in that struggle. That's not the revolution that I'm fighting for. And, I'm not going to join that party. He's saying, I'm part of this party. I'm part of the Surrealist group. I don't need to join the Communist Party. And so at that moment, he is expelled. And this pamphlet is the thing that he writes in response to that moment. He says, for example, it's on 140, from the viewpoint of the absolute, there could not be the slightest interest in seeing the social armature of the world change, or in seeing power pass from the hands of the bourgeoisie into those of the proletariat. So Artaud is not on board with communist revolution. He's on board with a different, deeper, more absolute form of revolution. And that's an important note to say. He says on that same page, again, on 140 in the middle, this is the long footnote. I refuse to assign to anyone but myself the responsibility for determining my limitations. I insisted on being free and the master of my own action. But what does all the revolution in the world mean to me if I know that I will remain in endless pain and misery in the charnel house of myself? The revolution that he wants to see is a revolution in his own consciousness and in his own body. It's rooted in that, not in the means to production and the social structures surrounding communist revolution. And he will remain unwavering in that commitment. So for him, the Surrealists, are selling out their ability to change the world. He thinks that Surrealism, with its appeal to maximum rebellion, its appeal to the expansion of consciousness and imagination, that is a revolution. But joining the Communist Party to fight on the left is not part of what he's interested in doing. But even in this text, we see his questions about spirit and matter, about meaning, are central to it. He says, this is on 141, what divides me from the Surrealists is that they love life as much as I despise it. Pretty strong. I aspire to another life is something else that he says. At the end of this piece, he says, my scruples in the face of real action, these scruples are absolute, and they're of two kinds. They're based on deep-rooted sense of the profound futility of any action whatsoever, whether spontaneous or unspontaneous. And that word action should be taken in many senses, and it should resonate with us, right? So action in this context means just doing stuff, but it also has a sense of revolutionary action. It has a sense of negation. It has the sense of, that Hegelian, but also Marxist sense of revolutionary action. Artaud's interested in something else that is different from action. Now, Bataille in Acephal will talk about this same problem, and he too will deny the Hegelian sense of action. For Bataille, what matters is not action in the sense of active negation in the world, but rather a kind of, what he calls the unemployed negativity, useless activity, waste. So they are in line on this point, and it plays out. But I love this next paragraph where Artaud says on 145 of selected writings, this is the point of view of total pessimism. A certain form of pessimism carries with it its own kind of lucidity, the lucidity of despair, the lucidity of senses that are exacerbated as if on the edge of the abyss. Alongside the horrible relativity of any human action, this unconscious spontaneity which drives one in spite of everything to action. So he is struggling, trying to figure out how to address his pain, his despair. Where is it gonna take him? In any case, it's psychological, it's personal. Revolution for him starts in his body and goes out from there. And that's the thing that he's gonna kind of investigate in Mexico. But shit, we're out of time. We've got 10 minutes. Are there questions about what I've been saying there? Anything? I'm trying to give us a sense of the rootedness in Pradeep. Yes.
Yeah. So based on what you were saying earlier and my own reading of and also understanding of Artaud's sort of fascination or inclination towards mysticism and occult in general, it seems more the kind of revolution that he was talking about was, in some sense, the alchemical transmutation, which is like in different levels. On a physical scale, could be said as transmutation of, let's say, mercury into gold. And that could be related to a bodily sense of Artaud, let's say. But I don't understand the sort of emphasis on body that you brought in the last part. I understand because Bataille is sort of inclined to the body aspect of it. And also Bataille is influenced via Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is via Heraclitus. I get that. But I'm not sure if that exists in Artaud very strongly. I'm not an avid reader of Artaud as of now as well. So that is not something that I understand. Yeah.
Right. So this is the thing that we need to trace out and kind of follow and see how he is. And that's why I'm emphasizing this aspect of his work, and sort of pulling that out at that moment, like drawing these specific connections between the body and pain, addiction, and revolution as personal revolution.
Yeah, but what kind of, like, if there are body parts where he felt pain and primarily during those aspects early in his early life, was there like a disease that was you mentioned syphilis once, and other aspects?
No, I mean, we don't have any, he's not saying, like my leg hurts. He's talking about psychological pain. And he's finding it rooted in his organic form. But he's asking, what is the root of this? And so that the thing that you were talking about, that alchemical transmutation, one thing I want to say about that is that when you read the Surrealism and Revolution lecture from February 1936, which I also asked us to read for today, we see a transformation of these perspectives, at least to some extent. He's saying the exact same things about surrealism, the problems of surrealism. Like surrealism doesn't go far enough. It's in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough. But he couches that argument in precisely the terms that you're outlining, right? So in Surrealism and Revolution, he is quoting occult figures and talking about alchemical transformation. You know, he talks about Chinese medicine. By a decade later, you know, if this one's written in 1928 and the other one's written in 1936, his journey into the occult has very much deepened. And he's gone to Mexico in search for it. Now, the relationship between spirit and matter and how that plays itself out in you know, occult materialisms, that's the thing that he's trying to figure out that question. But again, his when he talks about the body, it's simultaneously very visceral and physical. He you know, he talks about his body, but it's not a it's about his psychological relationship to his body and his discomfort with his body. So what is the relationship between mind and body? How are they related? How is that related to a broader sense of that? These are questions that we need to trace as carefully as we can over the next several weeks, right? These are things that we're going to find in the readings. It's certainly not answered here or in any of these two readings. And it's not stable either. So I want to insist on that. This is not something that stays. Artaud wants to figure it out, and he goes to Mexico trying to. So we're going to return to that theme. So another hand is up.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go.
I don't know how to formulate my question, but I'm just going to try to like sketch out some ideas.
Yeah.
When Artaud is he interested, when speaking of waste, is there an ecological environmental perspective that was already in that context of in the social political environment? Is he concerned with wastes of production as well, in a sense? Like, is he concerned with wastes? I'm finding a parallel between his emotional sort of all of these negative states, but there's also the waste, you know, environmentally sort of a larger collective waste that humans, you know, splur out on the environment. And I wonder if he was interested in that kind of ecological, alchemical ecological, in the sense of the
yeah, I understand.
Of Nigredo as well, as Nigredo as, like, you know, yeah.
So that's a very complicated question, and what we want to do is trace it once again over the weeks to come. So one thing to say about it, though, is that you know, nature doesn't have waste in the sense of in the sense that it only has the circulation of energies. So all that there is, and this is, you know, this is what Bataille is also thermodynamics. You know, it's a closed universe. Everything just changes position. So you have the borders of systems opening onto one another, and we can say many more things about that. So in you know, one system calls it waste, another system calls it food. So Artaud is really more interested in that sort of interplay and the cosmic exchange, and, you know, the world as fire. And that's the way that Bataille sees it. That's the Heraclitean vision. It's not waste in the sense of the rationalization of production that we might get in a kind of Marxist model, or even in a capitalist model, right? Where you want to reduce waste for greater efficiency. We want to solve sustainability by becoming ever more efficient. No, what we want to do is we want to manage the circulation of energies so that it fulfills the right psychological and social needs, you know, of people in society, et cetera. And so where we see this in Artaud, and here I know we're right at the end of time, but where we see this in Artaud is in that the last reading that I asked you guys to do for today, which is the preface to The Theater and Its Double. And in this, which he wrote in the end of 1935, it's published in October 1935. So it's essentially a program piece for his journey to Mexico and what he's looking for there. He is saying that what we need to do is return to nature. So he's talking about culture and what it is. Culture that's just books doesn't help us. We need to understand our relationship to the earth. It's good that our excessive facilities are no longer available. This is on page 10 of Theater and Its Double. It's good that our excessive facilities are no longer available, that forms fall into oblivion. A culture without space or time, restrained only by the capacity of our own nerves, will reappear with all the more energy. It's right that from time to time, cataclysms occur which compel us to return to nature. In other words, to rediscover life. The old totemism of animals, stones, objects capable of discharging thunderbolts, costumes impregnated with bestial essences, everything, in short, that might determine, disclose, and direct the secret forces of the universe. For us, a dead thing from which we derive nothing but static and the profit of an audience, not of an actor. So he wants to reawaken a way of inhabiting those energies. He says, what has lost us culture is our Occidental idea of art and the profits we seek to derive from it. Art and culture cannot be considered together, contrary to the treatment of universally according them. True culture operates by exaltation and force, while the European idea of art attempts to cast the mind into an attitude distinct from force, but addicted to exaltation. So what he wants to do is return us to an authentic, and this is page 11 of Theater and Its Double, an authentic relationship to the energies of the earth. In Mexico, since we're talking about Mexico, there's no art. Things are made for use, and the world is in perpetual exaltation. That's what Artaud is in search of, is perpetual exaltation, whatever that means, right? So we got to figure out what that means and how he's going to find it, and what it means for the individual body, how it heals the body, how it heals consciousness, how it heals culture. And that's what we're looking for in this class.
Thank you.
So we're out of time, right?
We run late a bit. I mean, we can take some additional time, 10 minutes, for instance. It's okay.
Okay, so what I'd like to do now is, there were other readings that we didn't get to today, so I'll make some brief remarks about them at the beginning of next week. But they're basically just setting us up for thinking about what I just read from that piece. So next week, really, we're going to Mexico. But we do have presentations at the end of class next week, and you're supposed to work in groups for this. And there's going to be a sign-up sheet that Ivan is going to circulate in some manner that's none of my business. But in anticipation of that, I thought we should just each say hello and what your background is maybe, or what your interest is just so we have a sense of kind of who's in the room and where we're going with this. So I'm thinking just very briefly here, like I'm Stuart Kendall. I translated a bunch of books by Bataille. I'm interested in intellectual history. So something like that would be what I'm looking for. Not 5 minutes, but somebody who wants to go first? Anybody?
I can go because I actually need to leave pretty soon.
Great.
I really don't have much to say either. My name's James, and I've read little bits of Artaud before, but never really kind of sat down and dove in. So yeah, I guess this is the kind of chance to do that.
Okay, great. That's fantastic.
My name is João. I am from Brazil. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and I'm
Okay.
currently interested in visual arts. I just got my first exhibition. I'm quite happy. And
Congratulations.
and yeah,
That's great. Somebody else?
My name's Georgia. I'm from London originally, and I'm an artist and a writer, and I live in Mexico City.
Oh, well, great. So it's close to home then, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, hence the comments about like, does he know who the Pri are? Like, yeah.
Right. Great. That's fantastic. Somebody else. Volunteers. Pradeep.
You can hear
I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I'm Pradeep. I'm from India. I am a designer by profession. Yeah, that's it.
That's great. That's fantastic. Somebody else?
I'm Clarice. I'm from Brazil too.
Oh.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm from Brazil. I'm from Brasilia specifically, and I study philosophy, and my research is most focused on libido materialism, Joyce Bataille, and you know, is that.
Great. That's fantastic. Me too. Somebody else? Somebody just say something. One sentence.
So I am Eme. I'm from Colombia. I'm a musician, and also I have a bachelor degree in philosophy, and I'm also currently enrolling into an MA on Latin American Studies here in Bogota in Javeriana University.
Oh,
And
wow.
my research goes around Medellin, sonic fiction, and colonialism through sound and music in the local territories.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great. Others? Got like 3 people.
My name is Traian Kerekes. I was born in Bucharest, Romania. I'm a visual artist working with assemblages from wastes, recovered materials, and I'm interested in this relationship between affects and artifacts, and how these current wastes are creating a new conditions or new possible myth scenarios for I don't know, new adaptive forms.
Yeah. Fantastic. Others?
I'm Arnab from India, and I have a first degree and master's in English, and
Okay.
also a second MA that I'm completing from GCAS. It's a MA in theology, and this is my second semester at the new center, and my research interest is mainly in individuation, meaning making, and
Great.
the ecology of energies. So that's it.
Yeah. Well, this is a class for you. I mean, I think all of us, but last couple of folks. Gio? All right. People are shy, so we'll just...
Hello,
Yes.
don't know if you guys can hear me. Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Gio Lingao. I'm a filmmaker from the Philippines. I'm on my way home right now. Sorry.
Ah,
I'm making a new film actually, and I just shot a few scenes a while before this session actually. So happy to be in this class.
Okay. So hard to talk. That's understandable. But great to have you. All right, so I guess we'll let it go with that, and rather than dragging it out too much more. But I'm excited to see that there's so many people from different orientations and backgrounds and interests here. I love having a conversation that has multiple kind of directions to it and points of focus and purposes. So, you know, as I think Ivan might have said at the beginning, you know, I've taught in a lot of different contexts, and you know, I'm a writer, and intellectual, I think, is what I do. But I love talking about design and contemporary culture and meaning making and all of this. So you know, we can take this conversation in all of these directions. And Artaud is a particularly rich figure because he's relevant to so many of these discussions, and there's so much material. You know, just in terms of the interpretive legacy, but then also just in what Artaud is doing, and his rediscovery right now. So I think it's really exciting that we have so many people from different backgrounds with different goals that are interested in doing this right now. So there it is. And like I said, I think Ivan's gonna circulate a thing. I don't know if so the idea for the presentations is that they can be either in person, like you can talk about it, or you can create a thing that we're going to watch together. But the idea is for us to, you know, effectively we're going to have 2 hours of basically more of the same as what we did today. Prepare the texts, have conversation about the texts, and then we'll have the final 30 minutes of presentation and engagement, whether it's in person or a thing that you make. And the idea is that you do it as groups. So there'll be a sign-up sheet, and then you guys can talk amongst yourselves as a group to determine what you want to do. So the other elements of you know, the grade in this class have to do with you need to make this presentation or participate in it. You need to participate in class, and you need to have a final project. So I don't know how many people are just kind of auditing or are taking this for, you know, credit. But those are the elements for credit. You have to do those three things: the presentation, the participation, and the final project. For the final projects, since everyone's got a different thing, that would be a thing that we're going to probably each have to talk about independently. So shoot me an email, and we can talk about what you want to do for your project. And it can be either a paper in a traditional sense, or it could be something else, you know, time-based media of some kind. And you know, like I'm comfortable with all manner of objects in terms of assessing the validity of a response to the class. But again, it's a personal project, personal response. So that's a thing that we will determine individually. I'm happy to talk about all of this. You know, so for sort of obviously for the next several weeks, we have these gatherings on Saturdays together where we're going to try and focus on specific materials. But if you've got other stuff that you want to kind of throw out or ask a question about or something like that, please do email me either at the at stuart.kendall@newcenter.org or at stuartkendall@gmail.com. So however you feel like you want to reach out, I'll be checking both those emails, you know, all the time, probably too much. So Ivan, is there anything else you want to say?
Oh, no, it's okay. I wanted to say that I think I'm gonna write a letter where I'll share your email so that everybody could contact you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's on the syllabus, and also I'm not hard to find. You know, if you look for me on the internet, I'm there. So yeah, and otherwise, I will see you guys back here again next Saturday morning. So
thank you for this fascinating session.
Thank you for coming and participating.
Thank you, Professor.
All right.
Everybody.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.